On our 5-year anniversary. My husband dropped divorce papers onto my dinner plate. "Sign them," he demanded. His mother smirked. His sister filmed, and his young mistress stood behind him like a new queen. I did not cry or beg. I simply signed my name, watching him like a man torching his own house. The Mercer family had no idea my signature merely legalized the fastest way to bury them alive. I am Nora Wood. The private dining room on the highest floor of the glittering Chicago hotel felt less like a celebration of love and more like a beautifully upholstered velvet coffin. It was the night of our 5-year wedding anniversary. The crystal chandeliers overhead cast fractured, icy shards of light across the pristine white linen tablecloth, illuminating the suffocating perfection of the evening. Every silver fork was precisely aligned, every wine glass polished to a blinding shine. Yet the air in the room was terribly thin, choked by the scent of expensive perfume and unspoken resentment. Across the wide table sat the Mercer family, holding court like the petty royalty of a kingdom built entirely on delusions. My mother-in-law, Elaine Mercer, took a slow, deliberate sip of her $90 glass of Pinot Noir. Her sharp, predatory eyes raked over my dark, unbranded silk dress. "Nora, dear," Elaine said, her voice dripping with that specific brand of wealthy Midwestern passive aggression. "I always admire your absolute commitment to modesty. Most women would have dressed up for a 5-year milestone at an establishment like this. But I suppose when you spend your days buried in compliance files and pushing paper at a desk, fashion naturally becomes an afterthought." Beside her, my father-in-law, Russell Mercer, chuckled loudly. He adjusted his imported silk tie, projecting the faux aristocratic air of an American man who inherited his wealth rather than earned a single dime of it. "Now, Elaine, leave the girl alone. Someone has to do the dreary backstage work. We cannot all be brilliant visionaries like our Caleb. Though, Nora, a pop of bright color would not kill you. You blend right into the wallpaper." I did not react. I did not frown. I simply took a measured, silent bite of my sea bass. At the far end of the table, my sister-in-law, Tessa Mercer, was completely absorbed in adjusting a portable ring light attached to her smartphone. She was 24 years old, hopelessly addicted to online validation, and currently live-streaming what she claimed was an intimate family gathering. "Just getting the perfect angles right for the memories," Tessa chirped. Her digital lens pointed suspiciously close to my side of the table. You never know what authentic moments will go viral on the internet. She was waiting for a train wreck. She just did not know which train was about to derail. Then, Caleb Mercer stood up. My husband of exactly 5 years. He tapped his heavy silver spoon against his crystal champagne flute, the sharp piercing ring cutting through the ambient jazz playing softly from the hidden wall speakers. He smoothed the lapels of his custom-tailored suit. It was a suit paid for by the very company I had legally and financially structured from the ground up. Though his fragile ego would force him to die before ever admitting that truth out loud. 5 years? Caleb began, his voice projecting across the private room as if he were addressing a crowded boardroom of venture capitalists rather than his immediate family. Half a decade. When I look back at the man I was exactly 5 years ago, I barely recognize him. I was a man with a raw vision, a massive startup dream, and a lot of impossible hurdles. Marriage, they always say, is a true partnership, a shared, equal journey. Elaine smiled proudly, practically glowing. Russell nodded in solemn agreement. Tessa made sure her phone was recording every single second in high definition. Caleb looked down at me, and the charming, rehearsed smile dropped from his face, replaced by a cold, hard line of pure disdain. But sometimes, a journey requires maximum speed, and you absolutely cannot climb to the peak of the mountain when you are dragging a heavy anchor. For the past several years, I have built Stratline transit systems into a regional powerhouse. I have networked, I have pitched, I have bled for this immense success, and I have done it all while being constantly weighed down by a woman who lacks ambition, lacks vision, and frankly, lacks the capacity to stand beside a man of my caliber. He reached down into his expensive leather briefcase resting on the empty chair beside him. He pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila envelope and slammed it violently onto the pristine white tablecloth directly in front of my dinner plate. The heavy thud made the crystal glasses tremble and the silverware rattle. "I am filing for divorce, Nora," Caleb announced, his voice booming with rehearsed, triumphant theatricality. "I want you out of the company penthouse by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. I want you completely detached from my personal and professional life. You are done leeching off my hard work. You are done pretending my success is yours." Before the harsh echo of his cruel words could even fade into the heavy curtains, the solid mahogany doors of the private dining room opened. Bianca Vale stepped inside. She was the company's new image director, 27 years old, almost a full 10 years my junior. She wore a striking, skin-tight crimson dress that left absolutely nothing to the imagination. She glided confidently across the thick carpet with the unearned arrogance of a newly crowned queen and wrapped her delicate arm intimately around Caleb's shoulder. "We are moving on, Nora," Bianca said, flashing a blinding, perfectly whitened, predatory smile. "Caleb needs a real partner who matches his high energy, someone who actually understands the massive future he is building." The cruelty of their planned choreography was flawless. Elaine broke into polite, victorious applause, clapping her manicured hands together. Russell let out a loud, booming laugh, raising his glass of expensive whiskey toward Bianca in a silent, mocking toast of approval. Tessa literally leaned her body across the table, shoving her glowing phone camera just inches from my face, desperate to capture the exact second my heart broke for her followers. Caleb stood tall, puffing out his chest, waiting for the inevitable hysterics. He wanted me to scream. He wanted me to cry loudly. He wanted me to beg on my knees right there on the carpet. He desperately needed me to shatter into a million pieces so he could perfectly complete his performance as the noble, long-suffering genius who was finally freeing himself from a toxic deadweight wife. The luxurious room fell dead silent, the entire family holding their breath, waiting for my pathetic performance. I did not cry. I did not beg. I did not make a single sound. I did not raise my voice by a fraction of a decibel. I calmly reached out my hand and pulled the thick stack of divorce papers from the envelope. The legal paper was expensive, thick and crisp. I completely ignored the glaring camera lens shoved in my face. I ignored Caleb's arrogant, expectant glare and Bianca's smug, victorious posture leaning against his arm. I slowly flipped past the standard dissolution clauses. I flipped past the aggressive asset division demands where he claimed 100% ownership of Stratline Transit Systems. I went straight to the dense financial disclosures and liability waivers buried at the very back of the massive document. My eyes scanned the complicated legal jargon with practiced speed. And then, I saw it. It was a specific, highly toxic clause tucked neatly into the third to last page. Caleb's aggressive lawyers, in their blind haste to completely sever me from the company's future profits and isolate me from his wealth, had drafted a blanket assumption of total executive control and absolute liability for the past 24 months. Furthermore, they had explicitly categorized the massive initial seed money I had secretly injected into his failing startup as unsecured personal capital injections, rather than marital gifts, in a clumsy, greedy attempt to prevent me from claiming any equity in the divorce. They had fundamentally misunderstood the hidden corporate structure of Blackthorn Recovery and Risk, the fictional shell company I secretly managed. What Caleb thought was an ironclad shield to protect his imminent fortune was not a shield at all. It was a perfectly laid trap, and he had just willingly, enthusiastically stepped right into the sharpest jaws. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out a sleek, heavy black fountain pen. I uncapped it with a soft, metallic click that sounded exactly like a pistol hammer pulling back in the quiet room. "Nora, do not make this harder than it needs to be," Caleb warned, his brow furrowing slightly, clearly disturbed by my total lack of tears. I signed my name beautifully on the dotted line, The dark ink flowed smoothly, stark and black against the bright white page. I calmly turned the page and signed the next required section. Then I signed the final one. I capped the pen. I placed the heavily signed documents neatly back into the manila envelope and slid it slowly across the polished wood table toward him. "Thank you, Caleb," I said. My voice was entirely steady, entirely hollow of the desperate grief he so hungrily craved. I looked right into his eyes, not with blinding anger, but with the cold, detached pity one reserves for a foolish man whom you have just watched confidently strike a match while standing knee-deep in a pool of gasoline. I stood up slowly from my velvet chair and smoothed the skirt of my unbranded silk dress. I reached back into my purse, pulled out my heavy black credit card, and signaled the private waiter who was hovering nervously near the exit doors. "Put the entire dinner bill on this card, please," I instructed the waiter clearly. "Include a 30% gratuity. The Mercer family is celebrating." I turned my back on them and walked purposefully toward the exit. The silence behind me was no longer excited and expectant. It was heavy, thick with a sudden, creeping unease. Tessa had slowly lowered her phone, the screen dipping toward the floor. Elaine's victorious, mocking smirk had frozen into a confused, tight grimace. Caleb stared down at the signed envelope resting on his plate, as if it were an explosive device ticking rapidly down to 0. They thought I was walking away in utter defeat. They did not know I was simply leaving the blast radius before the detonation. I did not direct my driver back to the sprawling, glass-walled penthouse Caleb and I had shared for the past 3 years. That space was already contaminated. Instead, I had him drop me off at a discreet, high-security boutique hotel tucked away in the financial district. I checked into an anonymous corner suite of us under my maiden name, dropped my keys on the marble counter, and walked straight to the desk. I did not take off my coat. I did not kick off my heels. There was 0 time for exhaustion. At exactly 11:45 that evening, I dialed the personal cell phone of Jonas Pike. Jonas was not a divorce attorney. He was a corporate litigator, the kind of man you called when hostile takeovers turned bloody. "Nora," Jonas answered on the second ring, his voice raspy but entirely alert. "It is nearly midnight on a Thursday. Please tell me your husband finally did something actionable." "He served me at the dinner table," I said, my tone flat, stripping away any lingering emotion. "In front of his entire family and the new woman he just hired as his image director. He wants me completely removed from the penthouse by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." Jonas let out a low, sharp breath. "I will draft the emergency injunctions right now. We can freeze the marital assets before the banks open at 9 o'clock. "No," I stopped him immediately. "Do not freeze anything. Let him have the narrative. Let him think he caught me completely off guard." "Jonas," I read the dissolution packet he dropped on my plate. "His legal team got sloppy because Caleb was rushing them. He wanted a theatrical execution, and he let his ego dictate the paperwork." I heard the sound of a leather chair creaking as Jonas sat up straighter. "Explain." "To prevent me from claiming any operational equity in the divorce, Caleb just signed a series of sworn affidavits attached to the settlement offer," I explained, staring at the glowing city lights through the glass. "Under penalty of perjury, he claimed absolute, unquestioned executive control over every single decision made at Stratline Transit Systems for the last 24 months. He swore that I had 0 input, 0 managerial oversight, and 0 operational authority. He is trying to legally erase your footprint so you cannot ask for a founder's payout." Jonas noted. "Exactly," I replied. But he went one step further. He also reclassified the initial seed funding I gave him 4 years ago. He is trying to protect his current valuation, so rather than acknowledging my money as a marital contribution, which would entitle me to half the company, his lawyers categorized every single dollar I ever put in as unsecured, third-party commercial loans. The line went dead silent for a long moment. When Jonas finally spoke, his voice was thick with predatory amusement. "He legally separated your money from the marriage. He basically just admitted, on paper, That his company owes a massive, distinct corporate debt to an outside creditor. Yes, I said. And what Caleb completely forgot in his desperate rush to secure his fortune is that the creditor is not me, the wife. The creditor is Blackthorn Recovery and Risk. And he just indemnified me from all the regulatory fallout that is about to hit him. I hung up the phone and immediately opened my encrypted laptop. Blackthorn Recovery and Risk was a holding company I established years ago when I first realized Caleb was treating corporate compliance like an annoying suggestion rather than the law. I knew his reckless ambition would eventually crash. So I structured every financial bailout I gave him through Blackthorn. I logged into the secure portal and activated the shadow legal team. I typed out my directives with rapid, precise keystrokes. I ordered them to immediately audit all the active uniform commercial code filings. I needed them to quietly verify the status of the old liens we held. Caleb walked around Chicago believing his brilliant logistics startup owned all its assets free and clear. He was fatally wrong. Blackthorn held the underlying paper on the proprietary routing software his entire fleet depended on. We held the conditional rights to the emergency reserve bank accounts. We technically owned the physical GPS tracking hardware installed in every single transport van, and we held the master leases on the 2 massive Midwestern transfer hubs he used to move medical supplies. Caleb thought those were just standard vendor agreements he had paid off years ago. He never actually read the fine print of the loan restructuring I had handled for him back when we were struggling. With Blackthorn actively locking the targets, I made my next call. It was 1 o'clock in the morning, but Lydia Crow picked up the encrypted line immediately. Lydia was an independent forensic auditor, ruthless, brilliant, and completely off Caleb's radar. "Lydia, it is Nora," I said, leaning against the cold glass window of the suite. "I need an accelerated, deep-dive review of the ledger for Stratline Transit Systems. Specifically, I need you to trace every outgoing wire transfer from the operational accounts over the past 90 days. "I am pulling up the shadow portal now," Lydia murmured, the rapid clacking of her keyboard echoing over the speaker. "You sound like a woman who just went to war." "My husband just drafted the Declaration of Independence," I corrected her. "I am simply honoring his request. What is the current status on his big push?" "The Great Lakes Carolines deal," Lydia confirmed, her tone turning entirely professional. "That is the whale. Stratline is currently scheduled to enter the final signing round for a regional medical distribution contract in exactly 1 week. The initial payout alone is worth tens of millions of dollars. If he secures that signature, his company valuation quadruples overnight." It all made perfect, disgusting sense. Caleb was cutting me loose exactly 7 days before the biggest financial victory of his life. He wanted the ink dry on our divorce, so he would not have to share a single dime of the Great Lakes money with the woman who built the foundation he was standing on. He wanted to walk into that new wealthy tier with his young, flashy image director, completely unencumbered by the wife who knew how pathetic he used to be. "Trace his recent spending," I instructed Lydia. "Look for anomalies. Look for anything that strays from standard logistics maintenance." I knew Tessa would spend the rest of the night furiously editing the video she took at the restaurant. By morning, she would upload a heavily manipulated clip to her social media channels. She would frame me as the cold, gold-digging wife who refused to support her genius husband, the parasite who was finally being scraped off his shoe. Caleb would inevitably start calling his investors tomorrow, playing the victim, talking about how my jealousy was holding him back. The easiest thing to do would be to go online, release the real timeline, and scream my truth to the world. I could easily prove I funded his early days. I could cry on camera and demand sympathy, but sympathy does not seize assets. Sympathy does not enforce contracts. I had no intention of fighting a messy, public domestic dispute. I was choosing a much more brutal, distinctly American corporate tactic. I was going to let him keep talking. I was going to let him keep signing things. I was going to let him parade Bianca around the city and brag to his wealthy parents about his massive impending wealth. The higher he built his pedestal of lies, the more devastating the impact would be when I quietly removed the floorboards beneath it. I closed my laptop. The blue light faded, plunging the hotel room into darkness, save for the ambient glow of the Chicago skyline bleeding through the window. I poured myself a single, neat measure of bourbon from the minibar, entirely for the warmth, not the intoxication. I stood alone before the floor-to-ceiling glass, looking out over the sprawling grid of the city. Down there, Caleb was likely drinking champagne, celebrating his brilliant execution of a flawless plan. He truly believed he had outsmarted me. He believed he had cleanly amputated me from his bright future. I did not feel shattered. I did not feel the crushing weight of a failed marriage. I only felt the cold, sharp clarity of a creditor who had just secured absolute leverage. I took a slow sip of the bourbon, staring down at the distant headlights moving along the dark streets, and whispered quietly to the empty room, "You just made the collection so much easier." Caleb walked through the revolving glass doors of the Stratline Transit Systems headquarters at exactly 8 o'clock the next morning. He was not just arriving for work, he was arriving for a coronation. Bianca was right by his side, her heels clicking sharply against the polished marble lobby floor. She held a steaming cup of artisan coffee in one hand and his arm in the other, projecting the precise image of a corporate power couple ready to conquer the medical logistics industry. Caleb's first agenda item for the day was not the massive impending hospital contract. His primary goal was a digital execution. He planned to spend the first 2 hours of his morning systematically erasing my existence from the company's servers. He wanted my keycard deactivated, my internal email archived and permanently deleted, and my name scrubbed from the corporate directory. He wanted to sanitize the building, transforming the day into a triumphant ritual of removing the ex-wife. He approached the sleek front reception desk, flashing his signature charismatic smile at the lead administrator. He expected immediate compliance. Instead, the administrator looked up with a tight, nervous expression. "Good morning, Mr. Mercer," she stammered, her eyes darting toward Bianca and then back to her monitor. "I was just about to call your private office. We have a slight issue with payroll processing for the independent contractors. The primary reserve account has been temporarily locked by the bank." Caleb's smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second. "Locked? That is absurd. Call the branch manager and tell him to fix the glitch." "It is not a glitch, sir," the administrator replied, handing him a printed automated notice. The notification explicitly states the account is frozen pending a mandatory credit verification protocol initiated by the primary lien holder. Also, the commercial fleet insurance broker called 10 minutes ago. They are refusing to issue the updated liability binders for the new transport vans. "Why would they refuse the binders?" Caleb demanded, his voice dropping a register, the polished veneer cracking slightly. "They stated that the system requires a fresh notarized signature from the registered compliance officer to validate the risk assessment. The system specifically flagged that the previous compliance officer has been unassigned, and they cannot proceed without her direct authorization." Caleb snatched the paper from her hand, his jaw clenching. He assumed these were just minor bureaucratic hurdles, the annoying red tape that always snagged the heels of visionary leaders. He turned and marched toward the glass elevators, Bianca trailing slightly behind him, her confident smile replaced by a look of mild confusion. By the time he reached the executive suite on the 12th floor, the minor hurdles had rapidly mutated into towering concrete walls. The head of the information technology department was waiting frantically outside Caleb's frosted glass office door. The man was practically sweating through his light blue dress shirt. "Caleb, we have a critical infrastructure failure." The director blurted out before Caleb could even unlock his door. "The overnight mandatory update for the central dispatch routing software completely failed. The entire fleet is currently flying blind. Drivers cannot access their optimized delivery schedules for the medical supply drops." "Then roll back to the previous version and manually patch the update," Caleb barked, throwing his briefcase onto his mahogany desk. "I do not pay you 6 figures to bring me easily solvable technical problems." "I cannot roll it back, and I cannot patch it," the director insisted, his voice rising in panic. "The system locked us out entirely. The core operating license has been remotely suspended. I contacted the vendor support line, and they informed me that the root license does not actually belong to us. It belongs to an external holding entity, and that entity revoked our user privileges at exactly midnight. Caleb froze. For years, he had blindly assumed that the complex routing algorithm was proprietary company property, or at the very least, secured by a standard, cheap software subscription I had set up when we first launched. He never bothered to read the architecture documentation. He was too busy pitching investors to care about the digital plumbing. Before Caleb could fully process the catastrophic reality of a blinded delivery fleet, the general corporate counsel for Stratline walked into the office. The lawyer did not knock. He looked pale, holding a single, crisp white envelope. "We have a massive legal situation," the lawyer announced, ignoring Bianca entirely. He placed the envelope carefully on the center of the desk. "I just received this by priority courier from the legal representatives of our original mezzanine lender. It is a formal demand for explanation and a notice of material change." Caleb stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. "A material change regarding what?" "Our senior debt," the lawyer said grimly. "Yes. The letter states that there is a high probability the absolute rights to our senior secured debt were quietly transferred and assigned to a completely undisclosed third party late last night. If this is true, we no longer owe the friendly neighborhood bank. We owe a faceless entity, and we have zero idea what their collection terms are. If they call the loan due immediately, we will not survive the week." The pristine, controlled environment of the executive office suddenly felt like a shrinking cage. The digital eradication of his wife had to wait. The system he thought he controlled was actively closing its jaws around his throat. Caleb slammed his fist onto the solid wood desk, the sharp crack echoing off the glass walls. He ripped his cell phone from his pocket and scrolled furiously until he found my number. I was sitting quietly in my hotel suite, drinking a cup of black tea and watching the morning news, when the phone on the glass coffee table began to buzz. I let it ring 4 times before I calmly picked it up and pressed the green button. "Nora," Caleb hissed into the receiver. His voice was laced with a venomous, barely contained rage. "I know exactly what you are doing. You are interfering with the company's daily operations. You are calling vendors. You are manipulating the software keys. And you are trying to sabotage my business out of pure, pathetic spite. Stop playing these ridiculous, vengeful woman games right now, or I swear to God I will bury you in civil litigation." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea. The ceramic cup clicked softly against the saucer. "I have not done a single thing, Caleb," I replied, my tone lighter than air, completely devoid of the panic he was desperately trying to provoke. "I'm simply sitting in a chair, drinking tea. I have not called a single vendor. I have not touched your routing software. The automated systems are just reading the exact legal paperwork you forcefully demanded I sign last night. You claimed absolute, isolated responsibility. The corporate infrastructure is simply honoring your bold declaration." "Fix this," he demanded, his breathing heavy and ragged over the speaker. "Fix the dispatch lockout right now." "I cannot," I said smoothly. "I am no longer an authorized representative of Stratline Transit Systems. You made that violently clear in front of your entire family. Have a productive day at the office." I ended the call and placed the phone face down on the table, while Caleb was busy drowning in the sudden, terrifying realization that his company was built on leased land. His sister was busy waging a completely different, entirely shallow war. By 10 o'clock that morning, Tessa had officially uploaded the meticulously edited video of our anniversary dinner to her primary social media channels. She had cut out Caleb's cruel monologue and her mother's mocking comments entirely. The final clip was a masterclass in digital manipulation. It showed Caleb standing tall, looking incredibly stressed but noble, placing the envelope on the table. It showed Bianca looking supportive and professional in the background. And it showed me, sitting silently, looking cold, detached, and utterly heartless as I signed the papers and walked out without shedding a single tear. Her caption was a calculated strike designed for maximum viral outrage. She painted me as the parasitic, ungrateful wife who abandoned a hardworking, visionary chief executive officer the second he demanded I contribute to the marriage. Within 2 hours, the video had amassed tens of thousands of views. The comment section was a toxic wasteland of strangers calling me a gold digger, a leech, and a bitter woman who could not handle a successful man. Bianca immediately capitalized on the manufactured momentum. She posted a series of vague, aesthetically pleasing photographs from inside the Stratline boardroom. The pictures showed Caleb pointing at a whiteboard, looking determined, with Bianca standing close beside him, holding a tablet. Her caption was carefully crafted corporate poetry about supporting true visionaries, overcoming personal distractions, and the power of having a real woman who actually understands the grind standing by your side. Caleb saw the engagement metrics climbing. He saw the flood of digital support praising his strength and his leadership. His fragile ego, deeply bruised by the morning's operational disasters, eagerly latched onto the public validation. He convinced himself that as long as the optics remained flawless, the underlying structural issues could be swept under the rug. He believed that if the public saw him as a winner, the banks and the vendors would eventually fall back into line. I sat perfectly still in my quiet hotel room, watching the digital smear campaign unfold across my laptop screen. My private phone was blowing up with concerned messages from distant acquaintances, but I did not reply to a single one. I did not draft a defensive statement. I did not hire a crisis management public relations firm to leak the truth about his seed funding. I just let the internet hate me. I let Caleb bask in the artificial warmth of public sympathy, because I understood a deeply bitter, fundamentally American truth about power and public perception. When the public is deliberately misled into elevating a fraud, they do not just politely change their minds when the truth finally comes out. When the illusion shatters, the public feels foolish for being tricked, and their subsequent vengeance, the massive, violent reversal of their opinion, is always 10 times more brutal than the original lie. The glow of my laptop screen was the only light in the hotel suite. The city of Chicago buzzed outside the glass, entirely ignorant of the quiet war I was waging from a leather armchair. I opened a deeply buried, encrypted folder labeled with a date from exactly 5 years ago. To understand how a man could confidently orchestrate his own public execution, one had to understand how he was built in the first place. 5 years ago, Caleb Mercer was not a polished, custom-suited visionary. He was a man with a genuinely clever concept for regional medical transport, a violently impulsive temper, and a personal credit score so disastrous that standard commercial banks laughed him out of their lobbies. He had the charisma to sell a dream, but absolutely zero operational discipline to construct the reality. I vividly remembered the night he came back to our cramped, one-bedroom apartment. His face was pale, his hands shaking. He had signed a predatory lease on a massive, decaying warehouse on the edge of the city, assuming he could secure funding before the first payment was due. He failed. The landlord was threatening immediate eviction, which would trigger a default on the only 3 delivery vans he had managed to lease. Caleb was 24 hours away from total financial ruin before his company even had a logo. I did not panic. I simply made a cup of black coffee, sat down at our scratched wooden dining table, and initiated a wire transfer from my private family trust. I quietly paid off the warehouse arrears, securing a 6-month runway, but money alone could not fix his fundamental incompetence. Medical logistics required flawless regulatory adherence. So, while Caleb spent his days having expensive lunches with potential investors who never called him back, I spent my nights reading federal transportation guidelines. I single-handedly wrote every single page of the compliance framework for Stratline transit systems. I mapped out the temperature-controlled chain of custody protocols. I drafted the driver background check requirements and the biohazard containment procedures. I built the invisible skeleton that allowed his company to legally bid for legitimate hospital contracts. But Caleb was afflicted with a terminal case of extreme male pride. the more my hidden architecture stabilized his business, the more intensely he resented the fact that he was not entirely self-made. He needed to be the solitary genius. He needed the narrative of the rugged entrepreneur who pulled himself up from nothing. Because I loved him, or at least believed I loved the potential within him, I willingly stepped into the shadows. I agreed to keep my name completely off the corporate registration documents. I intentionally absented myself from the glossy marketing materials and the high-stakes pitching sessions. I allowed him to stand under the bright lights and claim 100% of the credit for the flawless compliance system I had painstakingly designed. That generous sacrifice was the exact moment I sealed my fate with his family, Elaine and Russell Mercer, who had always viewed me as distressingly plain, seized upon my deliberate background role as proof of my uselessness. It is a shame Nora does not have the head for big business. Elaine had loudly sighed at a Thanksgiving dinner 3 years ago, ensuring her voice carried across the room. She is so content just shuffling papers and hiding in a cubicle. Thank goodness Caleb has the raw Mercer drive. A true visionary cannot be tethered to a clerk. Russell had chuckled, swirling his expensive wine. The boy is a shark. He built an empire out of thin air. You cannot teach that kind of predatory instinct. I had sat at that holiday table, cutting my turkey in total silence. They had absolutely no idea that the thin air their son built his empire upon was actually a series of massive, undocumented financial lifelines I had thrown him. They did not know that every time Caleb encountered a critical legal loophole he could not understand, I was the one who quietly stayed awake until 3 o'clock in the morning to stitch it closed. But I was not stupid. My love was patient, but it was never blind. I opened another subfolder on my encrypted drive. Here lay the meticulously preserved digital cemetery of our early marriage. I had saved every single email, every desperate late-night text message begging for a bridge loan, every bank transfer receipt, and every heavily redacted security annex from the era when Caleb survived purely on my grace. Every dollar I ever pumped into his failing dream was meticulously routed, tracked, and legally secured through Blackthorn recovery and risk. I clearly remembered the exact day my vocal support died and my cold, calculated silence began. It was exactly 2 years ago. Caleb had just landed his first Tier 2 hospital contract. He came home, poured himself a massive glass of scotch, and threw a poorly drafted vendor agreement onto my lap. Fix the indemnification clauses on page 4 before tomorrow morning, he had ordered. He did not ask. He did not say please. He did not even look me in the eye. And do it quickly. I have an early flight to New York to celebrate the win. He had stopped viewing my financial and intellectual salvation as acts of profound love. He had mentally reclassified my sacrifices as an absolute entitlement. I was no longer his savior or his partner. I was his unpaid, unacknowledged domestic utility. He believed his superficial success was his natural right, completely forgetting that the very ground he strutted upon was paved with bricks bearing my fingerprints. This was the fascinating, tragic paradox of Caleb Mercer. The wealthier he appeared to the outside world, the more aggressively he erased the memory of how he acquired that wealth. His entire identity was a fragile, towering monument to his own ego, built entirely on a foundation of my silent labor. I clicked open a scanned PDF dated from our 3rd year of marriage. It was a secondary mezzanine security guarantee. Caleb had needed a sudden influx of $300,000 to expand the fleet, a sum that exceeded my immediate liquid trust allowance at the time. To secure the commercial loan, Caleb had desperately gone to his father. My eyes traced the bold, arrogant signature of Russell Mercer at the bottom of the page. Russell had signed a comprehensive personal guarantee, using his own accumulated assets and his prized lakeside cabin as collateral to back his son's ambition. Russell believed he was co-signing a guaranteed winner. What Russell did not know, and what Caleb had cowardly hidden from his own father, was the predatory nature of the specific loan structure Caleb had chosen in his impatient rush for cash. If Caleb defaulted, the collection did not just stop at the company door. The legal language I was staring at was an absolute, unfiltered financial contagion. I leaned back in the leather chair, the cold realization settling over me like a heavy winter blanket. Caleb was currently running around the city, lying to his investors, lying to his new mistress, and lying to himself about the source of his corporate power. He believed he was just shaking off a boring wife to secure his grand medical contract. He was profoundly, catastrophically wrong. If Caleb continued to aggressively deny my underlying financial ownership, if he continued to pretend the corporate debt did not exist to protect his fragile image, he was not just going to lose his company. He was not just going to lose the multi-million-dollar Great Lakes Care Alliance contract. When Blackthorn Recovery and Risk finally initiated the aggressive collection protocols, the legal shockwave would bypass the corporate veil entirely. It would strike the personal guarantors. Caleb was not just blindly walking off a cliff. He was dragging his arrogant, clueless parents over the edge right alongside him. I closed the laptop. The room plunged back into darkness. He had demanded a clean break. I was simply going to give him a highly documented demolition. By the afternoon of the second day, Tessa's heavily edited video had crossed 1 million views. My public, dormant social media accounts were suddenly buried under an avalanche of digital venom. It was a perfectly executed modern lynching. Thousands of comments rolled in by the hour, labeling me a gold digger, a parasite, and a toxic, bitter woman who was trying to destroy a visionary man just because he finally outgrew me. The court of public opinion had convened, and my execution was trending at number 1. Caleb, riding the crest of this manufactured sympathy, immediately weaponized the viral wave. He spent his entire morning calling his nervous venture capitalists and his jittery mezzanine lenders. I knew exactly what he was telling them because the financial district is a very small, highly talkative neighborhood. He was spinning a masterful tale of a hysterical, discarded wife who simply could not handle his meteoric rise to success. He assured his backers that my supposed sabotage was nothing more than the pathetic thrashing of a jealous woman, a minor, temporary domestic dispute that his high-priced lawyers would squash before the weekend. I did not log on to defend myself. I did not type a single angry reply or draft a tearful public statement. Fighting in the mud only entertains the pigs. Instead, I let Jonas Pike do the talking. Send the preservation letters. I told Jonas over a secure line. Hit everyone. Within 2 hours, Jonas dispatched formal litigation hold notices to Tessa, the corporate board of Stratline Transit Systems, their 3 primary regional logistics partners, and, most importantly, the Executive Oversight Committee at Great Lakes Care Alliance. The legal directive was brutally clear. It mandated the absolute preservation of all emails, text messages, financial ledgers, video metadata, and internal communications. It carried a stark warning that any deletion, alteration, or destruction of data would be prosecuted as intentional spoliation of evidence. I was legally freezing the crime scene while the criminals were still busy celebrating inside it. I was just reviewing the delivery receipts for the hold notices when my encrypted secondary phone vibrated. It was an unsaved, prepaid number. Nora! A low, strained voice whispered through the speaker. It is Malik Harlan. I sat up straight. Malik was the chief operating officer of Stratline. He was a quiet, fiercely intelligent man who had been with the company since the 2nd year. He was the only person besides me who truly understood the complex physical logistics of moving sensitive medical supplies across state lines. Are you on a safe line? Malik, I asked, keeping my voice entirely neutral. I bought a burner phone, he replied, his breathing shallow and rapid. I need to see you, now, not in the city. Caleb is having everyone monitored. He is looking for whoever locked the routing system. Give me a location, I said. 1 hour later, I was sitting in a faded vinyl booth at a dilapidated diner just off the interstate, 30 miles outside the city limits. The smell of stale coffee and fried grease hung heavy in the air. Malik slid into the booth opposite me. He looked as though he had not slept in a week. His eyes were bloodshot, and his hands trembled slightly as he placed a thick, unmarked manila envelope onto the sticky formica table. "I cannot do this anymore. Nora," Malik said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, when you stepped back. Caleb took the leash off. He has been forcing me to sign off on operational reports that are complete works of fiction. If I refused, he threatened to fire me and ruin my industry reputation. I pulled the envelope toward me and opened the clasp. "What am I looking at?" "The real company," Malik answered bitterly. "You wrote the compliance framework to be ironclad, but Caleb figured out that actual compliance is expensive, so he started faking it. Look at the fleet maintenance logs." I pulled out a stack of vehicle inspection reports. The digital timestamps did not match the physical mechanic's signatures. "These transport vans are carrying highly sensitive medical equipment," I noted, scanning the falsified brake and refrigeration checks. If a cooling unit fails on a highway run, the biometric payload is destroyed. "It is worse than that," Malik pressed, tapping the table with a nervous finger. "The vehicles are not being serviced at all. They are rolling hazards." He is marking them as fully compliant and pocketing the maintenance budget. And look at the route manifests. He is fabricating delivery routes. He is double billing the emergency transport runs. If a hospital requests an urgent blood transfer, Caleb charges them the premium emergency rate, but he sneaks the delivery onto a standard, slow regional route and falsifies the arrival times. My blood ran ice cold. This was no longer just a story about a narcissistic husband trying to steal my financial equity. He was actively gambling with patient safety to inflate his profit margins. "How deep does the financial rot go?" I asked, my eyes never leaving the forged documents. Malik swallowed hard. He set up 4 shell vendor accounts, ghost contractors. On paper, they provide specialized hazardous material handling. In reality, they do not exist. Caleb has been using them to siphon hundreds of thousands of dollars straight out of the operational budget. Where is the money going? "Malik?" He looked away, staring out the dirty diner window at the passing highway traffic. "It is not going back into the company. The ghost payments are routed through a blind trust. I traced a few of the routing numbers before I got locked out of the system this morning. The stolen operational funds are paying the exorbitant monthly lease on Bianca Vale's luxury downtown penthouse. The money is paying for the aggressive public relations team Caleb hired to build his genius persona. It is paying for the catered parties, the custom-tailored suits, and the private flights to industry summits." I stared down at the papers in my hands. The full, hideous picture finally snapped into perfect focus. Caleb was not a brilliant businessman struggling with temporary cash flow issues. He was a reckless fraud running a massive, dangerous shell game. He had built a fake corporate empire sustained entirely by my initial money, a continuous stream of lies, forged safety documents, and a terrifying disregard for human lives. He was stealing the money meant to ensure the safe transport of critical medical supplies and handing it to his mistress to play house. Tessa's viral video calling me a parasite felt like a distant, childish joke compared to the staggering weight of the felonies sitting on the table in front of me. Caleb had spent the entire morning trying to convince the world that I was a bitter woman trying to ruin a great man. He had no idea that I was the only person holding the firewall that was keeping him out of a federal penitentiary. "You need to get out, Malik," I told him quietly, sliding the envelope into my leather tote bag. "Resign first thing tomorrow morning. Send a formal email citing irreconcilable differences regarding operational safety. Do not mention these documents. Do not mention me. Just create a paper trail that proves you tried to walk away." "What are you going to do?" Malik asked, the fear evident in his eyes. "Caleb wanted a public execution," I said, sliding out of the diner booth and dropping a $20 bill on the table for the untouched coffees. "I am just going to make sure he gets exactly what he asked for. Keep your head down. Malik, the blast radius is going to be massive." I walked out to my waiting car. The cold wind whipped across the asphalt. My husband thought he was fighting a divorce battle over bank accounts and bruised egos. He did not realize he had just triggered a full corporate whistleblower protocol. And I was the one holding the match. By Friday afternoon, the manufactured crisis in Caleb's mind had morphed into a full-blown theatrical production, starring himself as the tragic hero. He did not go to a bank to solve his sudden cash flow problems. Standard commercial banks required forensic audits, and audits required the actual truth. Instead, he drove his leased luxury sedan straight to the sprawling, manicured estate of his parents in the affluent northern suburbs. He collapsed onto the plush, imported leather sofa in their sunroom, burying his face in his hands. Playing the exhausted visionary to perfection, he told Elaine and Russell a masterful, tear-jerking lie. He claimed that I was maliciously using outdated administrative passwords to temporarily freeze the company's reserve accounts purely out of vicious, unhinged jealousy. He told them the Great Lakes Care Alliance contract was practically already printed, and he merely needed a temporary cash bridge to float the operational costs for a few short days until the ink officially dried. Elaine Mercer bought the performance instantly. She rushed to his side, stroking his shoulder, her maternal outrage flaring exactly as he had calculated. She desperately needed to believe her son was a titan of industry, being unfairly targeted by a small-minded woman. I always knew she would try to destroy what she could never build herself. Elaine hissed, her diamond rings catching the afternoon sunlight. It is pure, toxic envy. Caleb, you are about to step into the ultra-wealthy tier, and she is absolutely terrified of being left behind in the dirt. Russell Mercer puffed his chest out, his ego completely blinding him to the glaring red flags. A smart investor would have immediately demanded to see the balance sheets, the vendor contracts, and the compliance logs. But Russell was far too arrogant to ask his own son for a basic financial autopsy. To question Caleb's business acumen would be to question the flawless Mercer genetics. Russell wanted the country club bragging rights of a billionaire son much more than he wanted basic financial security. Do not let a bitter divorce stall a massive family legacy, Russell commanded, swirling his afternoon cocktail with a heavy hand. We will handle the bridge capital. Consider it a final family investment before the massive payout. What followed was a breathtaking display of generational financial suicide. By Monday morning, Elaine and Russell had voluntarily marched into the abyss to save a company that was already clinically dead. They prematurely cashed out their high-yield certificates of deposit, eagerly absorbing the massive early withdrawal penalties. Russell took out a heavy secondary mortgage on their primary estate. They even signed away the deed to the beloved historic family cabin on Lake Geneva. Leveraging every ounce of their accumulated generational wealth to gather the cash Caleb swore he desperately needed. They wired the funds directly into Stratline's secondary operational account. They genuinely believed they were buying their son a bridge to an empire. Caleb did not use a single penny of his parents' retirement money to fix the corrupted routing software. He did not use it to replace the dangerous, unserviced medical transport vans. He certainly did not use it to reimburse the emergency hospital funds he had systematically siphoned through his ghost vendors. Instead, he burned through the cash with the panicked, manic energy of a man trying to outrun his own shadow. He used a small fraction to quietly pay off the loudest, most aggressive local contractors just to keep them from filing public liens that would alert the press. He dumped a massive portion into the expensive monthly retainer for his aggressive crisis public relations firm, ensuring the digital smear campaign against me continued to dominate the regional business news feeds. The rest of the money was incinerated on maintaining an absolute illusion of victory. Bianca Vale was the primary architect of this delusion. She whispered toxic, modern corporate buzzwords into his ear, convincing him that projecting immense wealth was the only way to actually secure it. You have to live in the reality you are about to create, Caleb, Bianca purred to him during a lavish, catered lunch in the executive boardroom, entirely paid for by his father's second mortgage. Great Lakes Care Alliance is evaluating your power right now. If you show up looking like a man counting his pennies, they will smell the desperation. But if you walk in acting like a man who just signed a $50 million deal, they will beg to do business with you. The image is the ultimate asset. So, the cash burn accelerated to a terrifying speed. Caleb upgraded his private office furniture. He approved a wildly expensive marketing photo shoot for Bianca to elevate her corporate profile. He threw his parents' hard-earned money straight into the furnace of his own vanity, completely insulated by the belief that he was untouchable, while Caleb was busy buying expensive champagne to celebrate a victory that did not exist. I was sitting in my secure hotel suite, quietly executing a flawless financial assassination through the corporate veil of Blackthorn recovery and risk. Jonas Pike approached the original commercial bank that held the senior secured debt for Stratline Transit Systems. The bank was already deeply spooked. They had seen the sudden compliance lockouts, the frozen primary accounts, and the alarming irregularity in the payment histories. Banks absolutely despise uncertainty, and Caleb's company currently reeked of impending federal intervention. Jonas offered them a clean, immediate exit. Blackthorn proposed to purchase the entirety of Stratline's senior debt at a heavy discount. We offered them exactly 60 cents on the dollar. The bank, incredibly eager to wipe the toxic liability off their quarterly balance sheets before the federal auditors noticed, agreed within 48 hours. The transaction was executed seamlessly in the digital shadows. No press releases were issued. No public announcements were made. But the fundamental reality of Caleb's universe shifted permanently. He no longer owed money to a patient, bureaucratic commercial lender. He owed his entire corporate existence to me. I was now the primary lien holder. I held the absolute legal right to the desks his employees sat at, the vans his drivers operated, and the very brand name he had plastered across the city. I held the sharpest knife, and the blade was resting directly against his jugular. I drafted one single, brutally clear legal document. It was a formal notice of default and demand to cure. I did not list petty marital grievances. I listed cold facts. The document outlined the severe, undeniable breaches of the original loan covenants. It cited the falsified maintenance records, the unauthorized diversion of operational funds, and the catastrophic failure to maintain basic federal compliance standards. The demand was absolute. Stratline Transit Systems had exactly 72 hours to rectify every single financial and regulatory violation, restore the missing funds, and provide a full, independent forensic audit to the primary creditor. If the demands were not met within that specific timeframe, the legal trigger would be pulled. The entire principal balance of the loan would be immediately accelerated and called due in full. Total asset seizure would commence without further warning. Jonas dispatched the letter via priority courier. Caleb received the heavy, red-stamped envelope while sitting in his corner office. By pure coincidence, Elaine and Russell had stopped by the headquarters to admire the physical manifestation of their massive financial gamble. Bianca was perched on the edge of Caleb's mahogany desk, holding a cup of artisan coffee. Caleb ripped open the envelope. He scanned the dense legal demands, his eyes jumping over the aggressive clauses about debt acceleration and asset forfeiture. Because he fundamentally believed I was nothing more than an angry, powerless administrative clerk. His brain completely rejected the lethal reality of the document in his hands. He did not see a corporate guillotine falling. He only saw a pathetic wife throwing a desperate tantrum. "What is it, darling?" Elaine asked, sensing the slight shift in the room's energy. Caleb let out a loud, theatrical bark of laughter. He held the document up for the room to see, shaking his head in mock pity. "It is just Nora," Caleb sneered, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "She hired some discount lawyer to send a fake, intimidating demand letter from a shell company. She is making up imaginary compliance violations to try and scare me into a bigger divorce settlement. It is honestly embarrassing how hard she is trying to stay relevant now that she is permanently cut off from the real money." Bianca rolled her eyes, taking a delicate sip of her coffee. "It is so pathetic. She just cannot stand watching you thrive without her dragging you down. Do not even give it the dignity of a response, son." Russell scoffed, patting Caleb firmly on the shoulder. "Throw it in the trash where it belongs. You have a massive empire to run." Caleb did not just throw it in the trash. With a smug, triumphant smile on his face, he gripped the top of the crisp legal paper and ripped it aggressively down the middle. He tore it again, and then a third time, letting the shredded pieces of my final warning flutter like pathetic confetti onto his expensive office rug. He laughed loudly with his family, entirely convinced of his own invincibility. He had absolutely no idea that by tearing up that single piece of paper, he had just permanently bolted the door to his only possible escape route, trapping himself, his mistress, and his parents inside a building that was already burning to the ground. The walls began to close in on Caleb Mercer, not with a sudden explosion, but with the rapid, sequential slamming of heavy iron doors. By Tuesday morning, the manufactured reality he had purchased with his parents' retirement funds began to violently collapse under the weight of basic corporate scrutiny. The first door slammed shut at exactly 9 o'clock. The executive board of Great Lakes Care Alliance sent a formal, highly unusual email to the Stratline administrative team. The massive, multi-million-dollar medical distribution contract was no longer scheduled for a quiet, private signature in a closed boardroom. Instead, Great Lakes announced that the final review would take place publicly at their upcoming Vendor Integrity Summit at the end of the week. The email explicitly cited unforeseen anomalies in the preliminary compliance screening as the primary reason for the open forum. Caleb tried to casually dismiss it to his staff as standard corporate bureaucracy, but the sweat beading on his forehead betrayed his rising panic. The second door slammed less than an hour later. The primary commercial insurance provider for the medical transport fleet issued a mandatory suspension of coverage for over 40% of the active vehicles. A routine automated audit had flagged a massive discrepancy. The digital technical inspection dates uploaded to the company system completely failed to match the physical maintenance reports. Without insurance, those vans could not legally touch public asphalt, let alone transport sensitive biological cargo. Caleb was suddenly paying drivers to sit in empty parking lots, while hospital clients began calling the dispatch center, demanding to know why their urgent deliveries were delayed. By noon, the third door violently swung shut. Two of Stratline's most vital regional subcontractors, companies that handled the rural offshoot routes, simultaneously filed aggressive, public debt collection claims. Caleb had starved them of payments for over 6 months, funneling their owed money into his fake ghost vendors to fund his luxury lifestyle. The logistics industry in the American Midwest is an incredibly small, fiercely protective community. Within hours, the toxic rumor that Stratline Transit Systems was entirely insolvent spread like a wildfire across the freight networks. Dispatchers talked to warehouse managers talked to hospital procurement officers, and the illusion of Caleb's massive success began to actively rot in the daylight. Across town, Tessa Mercer felt her own personal trap spring closed. She had received the severe preservation of evidence letter from Jonas Pike the previous day. For the first time in her sheltered life, she realized that playing a vindictive digital game carried crushing real-world legal consequences. In a blind panic, she spent her entire Tuesday afternoon frantically deleting every single video, comment, and post she had made about our anniversary dinner. She scrubbed her channels clean, hoping to erase her cruel participation. She was far too late. My legal team had already secured forensic copies of everything, capturing not just the final defamatory posts, but the raw, unedited footage that clearly proved her malicious intent to manipulate the narrative. She had effectively handed us the exact rope we needed to tie her to the sinking ship. Meanwhile, Russell Mercer was slowly waking up to his own nightmare. He sat in the quiet, mahogany-paneled office of his personal wealth manager, a cold knot tightening in his chest. He had finally asked for a comprehensive review of the documents he signed to secure Caleb's bridge loan. The wealth manager gently, but firmly, explained the brutal reality of cross-collateralization. Russell had not simply given his son a temporary cash injection. The personal guarantees he had arrogantly scribbled his name onto meant that if Stratline failed to clear its senior debt, the creditors would not just take the company assets. They possessed the absolute legal right to seize the Mercer family estate, liquidate his retirement portfolios, and auction off the generational lake cabin. Russell walked out of the bank with trembling hands. That evening, he sat across from Elaine at their massive dining table, forcing a stiff smile and pouring her an expensive glass of wine, entirely too terrified to tell his wife that he had just gambled away their entire wealthy existence on a fragile lie. Faced with this suffocating pressure from every possible angle, a rational executive would have immediately grounded the fleet, called an emergency board meeting, and begged the creditors for mercy. But Caleb Mercer was not rational. He was a narcissist entirely backed into a corner, and a narcissist always doubles down on the illusion. His response to the impending corporate apocalypse was an act of staggering, arrogant stupidity. He directed his crisis public relations firm to organize a massive, wildly expensive gala to be held in the grand ballroom of the same hotel hosting the Vendor Integrity Summit. It was scheduled for the exact night before the final contract review. He invited every major investor, dozens of regional business journalists, and the entire executive board of Great Lakes Care Alliance. He believed that if he forced them all into a room overflowing with expensive champagne, loud music, and blinding displays of wealth, they would have no choice but to believe that his company was rock solid. He was trying to magically manifest stability by throwing a party on the deck of a sinking ship. On Wednesday afternoon, a private courier arrived at my discreet hotel suite. He handed me a thick, heavy envelope embossed with the Stratline corporate logo in shiny gold foil. Inside was an invitation to Caleb's desperate gala. Clipped to the thick cardstock was a small, handwritten note on his personalized stationery. Nora, the note read, written in his aggressive, slanted script. I want you to come. I want you to stand in the back of the room and watch me secure the biggest victory of my life. Come see the massive empire you threw away because you were too small-minded to support me. Dress nicely for once. I stood by the window, holding the arrogant little note, and I actually smiled. It was not a smile of amusement, but the cold, satisfied expression of a hunter watching her prey willingly walk directly into the center of the crosshairs. He genuinely thought he was twisting the knife. He thought he was proving his ultimate superiority. I walked over to my laptop and opened my secure email client. I did not decline the invitation. I chose that exact moment to formally confirm my attendance for the upcoming summit and the evening gala. However, I did not reply to Caleb or his glossy public relations team. I replied directly to the Chief Organizational Officer of the Great Lakes Care Alliance Vendor Integrity Summit. I confirmed my registration, completely bypassing the role of the bitter, discarded wife. I registered my attendance under my legal capacity as the primary managing director of Blackthorn Recovery and Risk. I informed them that I was attending as the sole holder of Stratline Transit Systems' senior secured debt, and as the fully capitalized entity prepared to purchase their clean logistical assets the very second Caleb Mercer's fraudulent empire officially collapsed. The doors were fully locked now, and Caleb had absolutely no idea that I was the one holding all the keys. For the next 48 hours, my discreet downtown hotel suite ceased to be a place of quiet refuge and officially transformed into a heavily fortified corporate war room. I had zero interest in staging a loud, emotionally exhausting revenge campaign. Screaming matches and tearful public accusations were the clumsy weapons of the powerless. I was not preparing a dramatic domestic confrontation. I was preparing a synchronized, clinical execution. Lydia Crow and Malik Harlan worked alongside me around the heavy mahogany dining table, fueled by bitter black coffee and an absolute shared determination to dismantle a fraud. The raw evidence Malik had smuggled out of the Stratline offices was undeniably damning, but in its raw form, it was a chaotic mess of scattered receipts and disorganized logs. A federal judge or an angry investor would not have the patience to dig through thousands of unorganized data points. We had to make the narrative of Caleb's massive deception completely foolproof. We had to make it surgical. Lydia's fingers flew across her keyboard, extracting the encrypted banking records, while Malik cross-referenced the fake transport logs with the actual GPS routing data he had saved. Together, we built a beautiful, terrible timeline. We traced every single stolen dollar from its legitimate origin in the corporate operational budget, through the labyrinth of the 4 fake hazardous material disposal companies, directly into Caleb's personal discretionary accounts. We isolated the specific invoices where he had double-billed regional hospitals for emergency blood transport. We highlighted the exact dates he had falsely certified the refrigeration units on the medical transport vans, actively risking patient lives to save a few $1,000s in maintenance costs. And, most importantly, we compiled a dedicated index of the diverted funds that went straight into paying the astronomical rent on Bianca Vale's luxury penthouse, her expensive public relations retainers, and the custom wardrobe Caleb paraded around the city. The most lethal part of the entire dossier was the signature column. Every single fraudulent wire transfer, every fake maintenance log, and every single ghost contractor invoice bore the direct, uncoerced digital signature of Caleb Mercer. He had demanded absolute executive control, and we were simply granting him the absolute executive liability that came with it. While we built the financial guillotine, Jonas Pike was busy preparing the dual legal fronts. Jonas did not just want to win a civil dispute, he wanted to permanently salt the earth. "I am launching a synchronized, 2-pronged assault," Jonas explained over the secure conference line, his voice vibrating with predatory anticipation. "The civil front is fully armed. The second the clock expires on our default notice, I will file the emergency injunctions to seize the physical logistics assets, the bank accounts, and the corporate intellectual property. Blackthorn Recovery and Risk will legally own the desk Caleb sits at." "And the second front?" I asked, scanning a printed sheet of forged vehicle inspections. "The criminal front," Jonas replied coldly. "I have established a back channel with the Regional Federal Fraud Task Force. They have already been quietly sniffing around the medical logistics sector for the past 6 months, looking for a target. I am going to hand them a fully wrapped, perfectly documented case of interstate wire fraud, healthcare billing fraud, and gross corporate malfeasance. Caleb is not just going to lose his company, he is going to lose his freedom." With the legal traps fully set, I had one final, crucial piece to move into position. I needed to neutralize the one man who possessed the power to accidentally save Caleb out of pure ignorance. I needed to speak to Devlin Cross. Devlin Cross was the formidable, notoriously ruthless president of the Great Lakes Care Alliance. He was the man holding the pen for the massive multi-million-dollar contract Caleb was currently celebrating. I did not go through Caleb's administrative gatekeepers. I used my own established industry credentials to bypass the corporate shields and secure a direct, encrypted phone call with Devlin on Thursday morning. "Mr. Cross, my name is Nora Wood," I began, my tone perfectly level. "I am the managing director of Blackthorn Recovery and Risk. I am also the primary architect who authored the original operational compliance framework for Stratline transit systems." Devlin was silent for a long moment. "I am aware of who you are. Ms. Wood, I am also aware that your husband just initiated a very public, very messy divorce. I have zero interest in getting dragged into a domestic dispute right before a major vendor summit." "This is not a domestic dispute, Mr. Cross," I corrected him sharply. "This is a risk management intervention. The compliance model I designed for that company is flawless. The logistics network is structurally sound, and the route drivers are highly capable. The salvageable core of the company is incredibly valuable. However, the current executive leadership has completely abandoned that framework. The man running the company is fatally compromised." I did not give him time to interrupt. I concisely detailed the existence of the ghost vendors, the lapsed commercial insurance, and the falsified biohazard maintenance logs. I told him about the debt acceleration and my impending seizure of the company's assets. "If you sign that contract with Caleb Mercer tomorrow night, you are chaining your hospital network to a sinking ship currently under federal investigation. I warned him. But if you hold the contract, Blackthorn Recovery and Risk will formally acquire the clean assets of the company by Monday morning. We will excise the fraudulent executive team, restore the original compliance protocols, and guarantee your supply chain without missing a single delivery. Devlin Cross was a man who understood leverage. He recognized a calculated corporate assassination when he saw one, and he respected the absolute precision of my approach. I appreciate the advanced intelligence, Ms. Wood, Devlin said, his voice dropping into a register of deep, mutual understanding. The Integrity Summit tomorrow evening has an open review segment. I discreetly invite you to attend. Not as the disgruntled ex-wife. I want you in that room as the senior debt holder and the official candidate to acquire the clean assets when the current structure collapses. I accept your invitation, I replied, but I have one strict condition. Everything must proceed according to exact corporate protocol. There will be no emotional outbursts. There will be no vengeful wife narrative. It will simply be a forensic audit. Cold-blooded, Devlin noted, a hint of genuine respect in his voice. I look forward to the presentation. The final piece was my physical armor. I had absolutely no desire to wear a flashy, revealing revenge dress. A revenge dress implies that you still desperately care about the visual approval of the man who wronged you. It is a loud, pathetic scream for attention. I did not want Caleb to look at me and feel attraction. I wanted him to look at me and feel an overwhelming, suffocating sense of his own insignificance. I selected a bespoke, charcoal gray wool suit, tailored to absolute perfection. It was a garment of quiet, undeniable power. No visible logos, no ostentatious jewelry. I paired it with a crisp white silk blouse and simple, sharp black heels. It was the exact uniform of a person who walked into a room not to ask for an explanation, but to deliver a final verdict. Across the city, Caleb Mercer received the automated notification that I had formally confirmed my attendance for both the summit and his ridiculous, expensive pre-celebration gala. True to his deeply ingrained narcissistic delusions, he immediately convinced himself that I was coming to surrender. He believed that women like me simply could not exist outside the orbit of men like him. He told Bianca that I was coming to stand in the back of the ballroom and watch him shine one last time, a pathetic moth drawn to the blinding light of his newly secured wealth. He needed to believe that lie to keep his own heart from beating out of his chest. Back in the hotel suite, the printers finally fell silent. The war room was quiet. On the heavy wooden table sat 5 perfectly identical, thick black leather binders. Inside each binder was the complete, undeniable autopsy of Caleb Mercer's fraudulent empire. There was no poetry inside those pages, only bank routing numbers, forged signatures, and federal statutes. I ran my hands slowly over the smooth leather cover of the first binder. They did not look like standard legal files. Sitting there in a neat, heavy row under the warm, ambient light of the hotel chandelier, each black folder looked exactly like a dark, solid brick. They were the final, structural materials I had carefully gathered to build my husband's permanent legal coffin. The grand ballroom of the Chicago hotel was a masterpiece of manufactured prestige. It was Friday evening, exactly 8 o'clock, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive floral arrangements and the low, greedy hum of corporate anticipation. Hundreds of people packed the floor: venture capitalists, regional logistics partners, hospital board members, sharp-eyed trade journalists, and elite financial advisors were all gathered, holding crystal glasses of imported champagne. They were all waiting to witness Stratline Transit Systems cross the final threshold and secure a multi-million-dollar medical distribution empire. Everything in the massive room gleamed. The towering crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden light over the branded ice sculptures and the crisp white linen of the cocktail tables. It was a perfectly hollow shell. The entire event was a spectacular, glittering balloon inflated to its absolute physical limit, just seconds away from a catastrophic pop. Caleb entered the room not like a man drowning in lethal corporate debt, but like a conquering emperor. He wore a custom-tailored black tuxedo that fit him with razor-sharp precision. He glided through the crowded floor, shaking hands, offering warm, practiced smiles, and projecting the flawless, magnetic aura of a self-made titan standing at the absolute pinnacle of his entire life. He was a man completely insulated by his own devastating lies. Behind him, the Mercer family played their tragic, pathetic roles to perfection. Elaine draped herself in a heavy silk gown that I knew for a fact was a temporary rental. Yet she commanded her corner of the room with the haughty posture of old money royalty. Russell stood rigidly beside her. He forced a wide, booming laugh every time a financial advisor approached him to offer premature congratulations, but his eyes were entirely dead. I could see the cold, suffocating terror radiating from his tense jaw. Russell was a man keenly aware that his entire generational wealth, his estate, and his retirement were currently balancing on the edge of a razor blade, entirely dependent on the signature of the hospital executives in the room. Bianca Vale floated through the sea of dark suits in a shimmering gold dress, clinging tightly to Caleb's arm. She nodded graciously to the chief medical officers, acting exactly like the newly minted first lady of a logistics dynasty, entirely convinced her luxury penthouse was secured for the next decade, tucked away near a towering floral arrangement. Tessa had her smartphone elevated on a sleek stabilizer, quietly recording the entire glamorous spectacle. She was desperate to capture the ultimate victory lap, praying for another viral hit to boost her shallow digital kingdom. At exactly 9 o'clock, the ambient jazz music faded into silence. A bright white spotlight carved through the dim room, illuminating the main acrylic stage flanked by massive digital screens displaying the Stratline logo. Caleb jogged up the steps with athletic energy, grabbing the microphone with practiced ease. The crowd immediately fell into a hushed, respectful silence. He spoke for exactly 15 minutes. It was a masterclass in narcissistic delusion and corporate theater. He talked passionately about the grinding journey of the entrepreneur, the sleepless nights, and the crushing weight of visionary leadership. He was undeniably charismatic. He knew exactly how to manipulate the room. Building a massive empire requires sacrifice, Caleb projected, his voice echoing powerfully off the vaulted ceiling. And sometimes, the absolute most painful sacrifice is recognizing that not everyone is equipped to travel to the summit with you. You have to be willing to shed the heavy anchors. You have to boldly, unapologetically walk away from the people in your life who are terrified by the sheer magnitude of your dream. A murmur of sympathetic agreement rippled through the crowd. Investors nodded sagely. They loved the ruthless, unattached founder narrative. For a few intoxicating minutes, the staging was so absolute, so visually overwhelming, that even I could understand why people bought into his lie. On that stage, surrounded by logos and bright lights, Caleb looked exactly like a winner. The applause was deafening as Caleb concluded his speech. He smiled warmly and handed the microphone to Devlin Cross, the imposing, silver-haired president of the Great Lakes Care Alliance. Devlin stepped up to the acrylic podium. He did not smile. His posture was strictly business, a stark, chilling contrast to Caleb's theatrical warmth. "Thank you, Caleb, for that passionate perspective," Devlin said, his deep voice easily commanding the vast ballroom without any effort. Great Lakes Care Alliance is deeply committed to expanding our regional medical distribution networks. However, as the scale of our logistics operations grows, so does our absolute mandate for structural and ethical integrity. Before we officially execute any binding agreements tonight, corporate governance requires one final procedural step. Caleb stood just a few feet away, beaming with supreme confidence. He casually adjusted his silk bow tie, entirely convinced this was nothing more than a tedious, standard compliance formality, a brief administrative box to check before the massive checks were signed and the celebration truly began. Due to recent, highly significant shifts in the underlying financial architecture of Stratline transit systems, Devlin continued, the temperature in the room noticeably dropping as his tone hardened. Our Risk Oversight Committee, in strict conjunction with the primary senior debt holder, has demanded a public confirmation of corporate integrity to conduct this final, mandatory review. I yield the floor to the Managing Director of Blackthorn Recovery and Risk, the fully capitalized entity that now maintains absolute secured leverage over all Stratline assets. Caleb's confident, brilliant smile instantly froze, becoming a rigid, unnatural mask. He blinked rapidly. The words, senior debt holder and Blackthorn, were clearly failing to process in his reality. He looked out into the sea of confused faces on the floor, expecting some gray-haired corporate banker in a navy suit to step forward from the audience. I did not emerge from the crowded floor. I did not walk in through the back doors like a discarded spectator permitted to watch from the shadows. I stepped out from the heavily guarded, restricted executive control wings directly behind the main stage. I wore the tailored charcoal gray wool suit. My footsteps were entirely silent on the carpeted stage, but my physical presence struck the room like a violent shockwave. Devlin Cross turned toward me, offering a highly respectful, formal nod. He leaned into the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, please direct your attention to Ms. Nora Wood, lead operational architect, sole proprietor of the senior debt, and the primary advisory council for the clean asset acquisition." I walked directly to the center of the stage and stopped exactly 2 feet away from Caleb. The color violently drained from his face in a single second, leaving him the sickly shade of dirty chalk. His jaw visibly slacked, his eyes wide with a sudden, suffocating terror as his brain finally connected the invisible dots. Down on the floor, Elaine dropped her crystal champagne flute. It hit the polished marble edge of the dance floor with a sharp, piercing shatter that echoed like a gunshot through the sudden, suffocating silence of the massive ballroom. Bianca physically stumbled backward, clutching her gold dress. Russell gripped the edge of a cocktail table so hard his knuckles turned entirely white. No one breathed. The entire room, packed with hundreds of the most powerful and wealthy people in the city, was completely, terrifyingly dead silent as they stared up at the stage. Looking directly at the quiet woman the founder had just publicly claimed was dead weight, I adjusted the microphone on the clear acrylic podium. I did not look at my husband with anger, nor did I mention our broken marriage or the humiliation of our anniversary dinner. Marital grievances belonged in closed therapy sessions. I was here for a corporate execution. 72 hours ago, Caleb Mercer signed a legally binding declaration under penalty of perjury. I began, my voice steady and amplified across the vast, silent ballroom. He claimed 100% executive control and absolute liability for every operational decision made within Stratline Transit Systems over the past 24 months. Caleb lunged forward, his face flushed with sudden, blind rage. But 2 of Devlin Cross's massive private security guards stepped seamlessly out of the shadows, blocking him from the podium. He was trapped on his own stage. "Let us review the exact cost of that executive control," I continued, pressing a button on the small remote in my hand. The massive digital screens behind me, previously displaying the gleaming company logo, instantly switched to high-resolution scans of financial ledgers. Over the past 3 business quarters, hundreds of thousands of dollars were systematically siphoned from the primary operational budget into 4 unregistered ghost vendor accounts. I clicked the remote again. The screens flashed to side-by-side comparisons of maintenance records and GPS tracking data. "You are looking at falsified biohazard maintenance logs and fabricated delivery routes," I announced to the room of horrified investors and hospital executives. Emergency hospital runs were double billed. The fleet was intentionally deprived of basic mechanical servicing, actively risking the destruction of critical medical payloads and the lives of the drivers on the road. The diverted capital did not go towards structural growth. It was directly funneled into a private trust to fund the exorbitant lifestyle of the current executive team, including the monthly lease on a luxury downtown penthouse. From the left wing of the stage, Malik Harlan stepped into the bright light. He looked exhausted but entirely resolute. As the chief operating officer, I formally confirmed that I was repeatedly threatened with immediate termination and professional blacklisting by Caleb Mercer if I did not sign off on those forged daily operational logs. Malik stated clearly into a secondary microphone. Next to him, Lydia Crow emerged, holding one of the heavy black binders. As an independent forensic auditor, I confirmed the absolute extraction model. The company was being bled dry from the inside to feed personal vanity. Jonas Pike walked directly up the center stairs of the stage. He did not use a microphone. He simply walked over to the frozen, hyperventilating Caleb Mercer and shoved a thick stack of legal documents firmly against his chest. Notice of debt acceleration and immediate asset seizure, Jonas declared, his voice easily carrying to the front rows. Your grace period expired at midnight. Blackthorn Recovery and Risk now legally owns everything down to the shoes on your feet. Devlin Cross stepped back to his microphone. He looked down at the crowd, his expression carved from stone. In light of this undeniable evidence of gross fraud, Great Lakes Care Alliance officially terminates all pending negotiations with Caleb Mercer. We will, however, immediately begin transition talks with Blackthorn Recovery and Risk to purchase the clean physical assets and secure the employment of the innocent drivers and staff. Caleb Mercer is entirely removed from this ecosystem. I looked down from the stage into the crowd. The Mercer family was physically crumbling. Russell Mercer stood paralyzed, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. I spoke directly to him, without a microphone. But the silence in the room was so profound, my voice carried perfectly. I strongly suggest you call your wealth manager first thing tomorrow morning, Russell, I said coldly. Those personal liability guarantees you signed in secret are now fully active. You used your primary estate and your retirement funds to back a fraudulent enterprise. Blackthorn will be collecting on those assets. Elaine let out a sharp, guttural gasp, whipping her head toward her husband. The horrifying realization hit her all at once. The country club memberships, the historic lake cabin, the luxurious retirement. It was all gone. Russell had gambled their entire existence on their son's lies, and he had lost everything. Near the back of the room, Bianca Vale did not stay to defend her visionary man. She turned and sprinted toward the exit doors, clutching her designer purse. She did not yet realize that her corporate credit cards had been deactivated 3 hours ago, and the luxury apartment she was running back to was already surrounded by federal asset seizure notices. Tessa Mercer dropped her smartphone. It hit the marble floor with a dull thud. She stared down at it, her hands trembling violently. The device she used to humiliate me was no longer a tool for viral fame. It was a neatly organized vault of digital evidence that would intimately tie her to her brother's sinking ship. This is a setup, Caleb finally screamed, his voice cracking hysterically as he pointed a shaking finger at me. She is a bitter, jealous woman. She forged all of it because I left her. He never got to finish his pathetic defense. The heavy brass doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. A team of federal agents from the Regional Fraud Task Force, accompanied by uniformed enforcement officers, marched directly into the room. Jonas had coordinated the timing flawlessly. The agents bypassed the bewildered investors and walked straight up the stage stairs. They did not read Caleb his rights quietly. They forcefully turned him around, snapping heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists in front of every single person he had spent his life trying to impress. 2 other agents flanked Russell Mercer on the floor, instructing him that he was not permitted to leave the premises, as he was now officially under civil and criminal investigation for financial concealment and fraudulent backing. 2 months later, the bitter Chicago winter gave way to a cold, relentless spring rain. I walked out of the towering glass lobby of the Blackthorn Recovery and Risk building at exactly 6 o'clock in the evening. The street was dark and wet. Standing near the edge of the sidewalk, completely soaked by the freezing downpour, was the Mercer family. Caleb was out on a massive, heavily restricted bail, his passport seized, facing decades in a federal penitentiary. He looked 10 years older, his custom suits replaced by cheap, wrinkled slacks. Elaine looked small and frail, stripped of her expensive jewelry and her haughty pride. Russell was a broken man, facing total bankruptcy and potential prison time of his own. Tessa stood behind them, looking terrified and incredibly small. They had waited out in the rain for 5 hours just to catch me leaving the office. They stepped forward pleadingly as I approached my waiting car. "Nora, please," Caleb begged, his voice cracking, entirely stripped of his former arrogance. "You have all the money, you own the company. Please, just pay for my defense attorneys. Sign a letter of support for the judge. Have mercy on my parents. Do not let them take the house. We are family." I stopped. I looked at the 4 of them shivering in the cold. I looked at the man who had served me divorce papers on a silver platter while his mistress smiled, and the parents who had mocked my quiet labor for years. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I did not say a single word. I simply looked at them with absolute, echoing emptiness. I stepped around them, the wet fabric of my coat brushing against Caleb's trembling arm, and got into the back seat of my warm, quiet car. As the vehicle pulled away into the rainy night, I left them standing on the pavement. The Mercer family finally understood, entirely too late, that the quiet, invisible woman they had spent years trying to erase was the only pillar that had ever held up their fake, fragile world. Thank you so much for listening to this story today. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Olivia Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by hitting the hype button so this video can be heard by many more people.